Jeanne, good evening and welcome.
Thank you.
Could you just tell us a bit about your book?
Well, I was always interested in the subject of South African English. What makes it different from English as spoken in other parts of the world, and whether it was different in fact. And then I came across a book called World Englishes by Professor Rajend Mesthrie. And I was intrigued by the title because for the first time, this is apparently quite a standard linguistic term, Englishes. But it was a first for me, and I thought it said exactly what I was wondering about, how one distinguishes Englishes. Of course, this is studied, and the book World Englishes does it in an analytic and formal way. So I approached Professor Mesthrie and asked if we couldn't write a layman's book, a popular book. And this is all explained in the beginning of the book, how we created this book. He wasn't very enthusiastic at first, and being an academic, he later had reservations because, he felt he might have overstated things in speaking to me, because this is the procedure we set up, that he would speak and I would record it and then transcribe it and so on. But this was the end result, EISH. But is it English?
So what does its title translate to?
EISH is an expression. It's part of what you might call black South African English.
Okay.
EISH is commonly used by South Africans now across the racial spectrum, but one could say originated with black South Africans. And it's just an expression, say EISH, but did you do the EISH? That's the title came at the end of the book, EISH, but is it English? But I think it expresses,
So you want to read the explanation of the term?
Okay. Some advertisements on radio and television are now playing around with black South African English. We cover Indian South African English, we cover Afrikaans influenced white South African English, the different groups in India, what you call sociolects.
Right.
A well-known example is EISH, a kind of complaint about hardships. It is widely used locally and can express anything from surprise to displeasure. And it goes on and on here, and we say, and the South African Revenue Service has offered to take the EISH out of taxation. This is the popular use of EISH.
So what's your background? It's been as an editor, you still
Yes, I worked in South African publishing as an editor for many years. I was in the Natural History Division. I began at what was then Strake, New Holland. And then I moved to New Africa Books. And I was the publisher for David Philip, which is an imprint of New Africa Book. David Philip is a well-known imprint, was a very progressive publisher in the apartheid years.
I see.
And has an amazing list. And then from that, I moved back into editing in a publishing group called Umuzi, which was the South African publishing arm of Random House. Now Random House has merged with Strake, with my original publisher, and Random House Strake has now merged with Penguin. So the group is Random House Penguin.
So your career has straddled both the pre-apartheid, the apartheid and post-apartheid eras in publishing?
No.
Okay.
I lived in South Africa during the apartheid years, but I only started working in publishing in 2000.
So what are the challenges that South African publishing faces today? Is it something similar to India, or?
I think India seems probably more vital. There's an amazing number of books being written, wonderful books, but it seems to me that the publishing on the decline simply because sales are so poor.
Where?
In South Africa. There's a very small reading and book buying public. There's not a book culture in South Africa. But on the other hand, in the airport on the way here, I was looking through the South African sections, which they have, as well as integrated sections in the airport bookshop, and just wonderful book upon book,
This is where?
This is at Johannesburg.
Johannesburg. So a lot is coming out. There is a vibrancy.
Yes, and non-fiction. On all sides, people are writing their story.
Yeah.
I think South African fiction is possibly not as vital as non-fiction. And I'm critical of South African fiction, but I see this non-fiction as just sort of blossoming.
So how do you kind of see this challenge of multilingualism in South Africa, because we have similar issues here?
Yes.
How do you cope with it in publishing sense?
Well, the publishers dedicated to publishing in local languages, but again, that depends on a book by public.
Yeah.
So that, it seems to me, takes place mostly in the context of education publishing, and so reaching out to schools and so. But as part of commercial publishing, there's very little publishing in local languages, and we have 11 official languages.
True.
But as I say, very little publishing in local languages. There's a desire, and in fact, a lot of talk about it. And I'm actually part of a group, a department of what is called Cultural Affairs and Sport, organizes conferences, and I've sat in and talked for hours. But I don't.
Is it an economic problem or a technical problem or a market problem or what?
No, it's simply a market. Is it a market problem? It's a market. And the problem of literacy. People are not literate in their own language now. And the problem, which is discussed in my book, of the dominance of English. There's this sort of feeling that English shouldn't be dominant, but the fact is that parents want their children to be proficient in English, because that's the way to being successful and earning a better living. And so there are all these forces, but that is a very interesting element in my book.
So what are the other elements in your book? If you could.
I am forced to ask that. The other elements are the South African vocabulary, which I think utterly fascinating. There's a dictionary of South African English.
I see. Published?
Yes, and many, many editions.
I see.
And there's the Afrikaans, there's a big effort to publish an Afrikaans dictionary to bring it up to date. I'm forgetting the details, I better go back and read my book. And that is one big element, the vocabulary, which is it's the easiest part of this book. It's the lightest, most interesting, I think. And then the grammatical structure of South African English, which for me is a very interesting element. There's a chapter on code switching. If you listen to a soapy in South Africa, has some very popular soapies. The language is just fascinating. The way they switch from English to this language to that. And we have a very interesting chapter on code switching. That's a chapter I'm particularly fond of. The Indian South African English, I think Indians in South Africa would love that, because we are very different. I'm not really a South African Indian, I'm an East African Indian. But Indian South Africans are actually very different in the way they speak English from Indian Indians. The intonations, the vocabulary, everything is very different. There are things like an Indian would understand lati charge. Lati charge?
Lati charge.
A South African Indian English wouldn't have a clue. Indian wouldn't have a clue about that. Right? But on the other hand, I suppose there are areas for that, but the difference is the more interesting. And then we talk about circles of English. This is at the end. Professor Mesthrie describes the inner circle, the outer circle of world Englishes, you see. And that for me was utterly fascinating, how these different Englishes in the world figure in relation
to each other
and to the mother country, which is the inner circle.
And your days in Kenya, as growing up in Kenya, I mean, do you find English being used as creatively there, or what?
No.
No.
There's not that element of creativity, I think. I think among black Kenyans, the level of creativity here is absolutely astounding. The shop signs and the misuse, to me, of words like buses plying from Kalangut to Baga, buses plying, this use of words.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating.
Sometimes it's very antiquated English that is being used in places like Goa. No, I think the newspapers also are notorious or were notorious for that.
Yeah,
they use English which is 50 or 60 years old.
Yeah. But this actually is a subject discussion I have with you, which is where you draw the line between acceptance, because you seem to me to accept everything, and non-acceptance. I said, what goes and what shouldn't.
True.
That's another element here about, what constitutes, is there anything such as correct English? Is there such a thing?
What's your take on that?
Our take is that the object of language is communication. So what matters is that the speakers on both sides, or the listeners on both sides, understand this language, and that's spoken English. So if it might be incorrect to say something, but if it's understood by both, then it's correct. But in written English, that doesn't always apply, I think.
You think South Africa has this richness because it's a melting pot of different cultures, races, origins?
Yes, definitely. Yes, it has this richness, has this diversity. Whereas East Africa doesn't have that diversity. It was a pluralistic society, but I guess it was so segmented. But apartheid segmented South Africa.
Also.
But I don't know. There's this coloured population. The equivalent doesn't exist in East Africa. And then the white population in East Africa is nowhere as indigenous as white South Africans are. They're an indigenous population. And then the black South African population somehow is more vigorous, or more, this is stupid, I don't think it makes sense. I don't know, it's a totally different scene. The South African scene is much more creative, I would think, and vital. And
what were the biggest challenges while writing this book?
Oh, my gosh, it was so tense, the transcription. I would go home with my heart in my mouth to see if I'd lost everything because I had a very fragile little recorder. Once I did lose it. Then Professor Mesthrie wasn't totally happy when he saw what he had said, because he had been quite casual, he had been reckless. When he saw himself in print, he suddenly became much more cautious, so he did an editing.
I see.
Then I found it a bit problematic to all. He'd done his basic structure, but I'd moved that around a bit. Then I checked on his editing, then went to an editor who, in my opinion, was too pedantic, because I wanted to retain the spontaneity of this book, which was that he had spoken it, and I had written it down. So all these, it was just exhausting, all this editing and inspecting, and it was much harder work than I anticipated.
What further plans on working on English, or the Englishes? Any plans, or that's it?
How do you mean plans?
Do you plan to work on this subject
on the
somehow?
subject? No. I mean, English is just a subject. It's fascinating for me, just being around English speakers is for me, like being in a laboratory, I guess. As you talk to me.
Yeah. Thanks so much.